Okay. Let's pull back together. There'll be a few stragglers coming back in. Does that give you enough time to walk all the way over and get coffee and come back? Yeah, okay. Well, if it wasn't, I'd give you more time. I want to be sensitive to the coffee drinkers. Make sure you have enough time to restoke your coffee. All right, well, let's get into, we're going to keep advancing this conversation, and we're going to continue to unpack a little bit of the why question, I think, in this part of the conversation. I'll just admit up front, I think, hopefully, I don't know if you've ever had anybody unpack it in this, in this kind of way with regards to the book of Job, but it's been a book that I've come back to a lot. So some of this is in wet cement. I keep saying wet cement. So that just means it's continuing to brew in my head and my heart and my scholarly life and reading and making connections and trying to get to the end of it in terms of understanding. So I'm just being honest. This is not something to break a church up over, but it might be helpful for you as you continue to think about these things on your own, in your own personal life, as they benefit you, and then could maybe filter down into your ministries of preaching and teaching and counseling and all of that. All right, so what's interesting is in chapter 2 in the book of Job, we see that we go into a second phase or a second round that Satan is going to have with the Lord and with Job. So the divine conversation continues. So we see a little bit of the same. Well, I'll just start in verse 1. Well, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came along with them to present himself before the Lord. That's interesting. I'll have to look at that. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan said to the Lord, "Well, we've been here before, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it. And what I'm not telling you, Lord, is that I'm looking for ways to destroy and muddle up your divine agenda." But that's another conversation. Verse 3, and the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him on earth, the blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Well, and Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life, the quality of his life. However, put forth thy hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face." And in a sinister grin that's not in the text, but it's probably there. So verse 6, so the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power," or the idea of your hand, "only spare his life." So you're not going to take his full life, but you're going to take away and remove the quality of his life through this physical ailment that will take place.
There's a Charlie Daniels song in here somewhere.
You think? Yeah. I've got one coming up. Not Charlie Daniels, but another one. But we see, again, even here, we haven't lost control of this word that I've never been able to spell all my life. Sovereignty. Anyway, there it is. And we see that the Lord continues to be in control in verse 6. That's important. So we're not going to, the Lord is not going to allow his life to be taken in this case. So Satan's on a tight leash here. And I've got the stories with all of you, I'm sure. I can tell you about, now we're in the realm of, and I'll add one to our list with my double thick black pen, is health. The idea in all the various categories of health. I'm reminded of this every time our choir has prayer, and our choir is made up of a lot of gray hairs, but some younger. We've got some millennials in there and all of that. But everybody's got their people to pray for people who are going through health issues, short-term, long-term recovery, or incurable things. It's just a matter of time. I think I don't lose track of all of these things with regards to the fallenness of the world. And part of my testimony in coming to know the Lord was over a long period of time watching my mom struggle with, back in the day when they didn't know what to do with breast cancer, when it got into the bone and kind of stuck around for a while. It was a slow-growing cancer while it was in the bone, so she had it treated in her bones, in her back, got into her backbone, and over time, then it grew into soft tissue. So over a period of about 10 years, she was a cancer survivor, and she participated in a lot of the pink events in that way. There's other pink events, but cancer survivor pink events. And she was a testimony of faith. She didn't ever complain like Job. And she was soft-spoken in it with her faith, but it was real and present. And this was this more serious part of it started to happen in the early years of my Christian walk after I became to know the Lord as a senior in college, and continuing to watch her struggle with this. But when it hit the soft tissue, I knew that it was just a matter of time, because then it was a fast-growing cancer, and it was not curable. They didn't have a cure for it. So watching her, if this has ever happened to you, this is just part of this experience, watching someone die. And I think, there's the little bit of the mystery that I've not been able to solve fully in terms of the timing of it or the duration of it. I don't think we have privy to that. Job's not going to have the answer given to him. Why all my sons and daughters? Why not just a few? God, why did you could have lessened the severity a bit on this particular situation that happened as a result of human sin and conflict and natural causes, and now my health. You put the exclamation point pretty high. You turn the volume knob really high on some of these things. Why so high? On a scale from 1 to 10, why couldn't it have been a 5 instead of a 10? We don't know. That's the mystery of the. I don't think the book of Job solves that, and we won't be able to solve that in this conversation. But we see an intensification of Job's testing, and still under the sovereignty of God, right? We still see those things going on. So let's see. I want to just remind ourselves of the conversation that we had earlier that really comes out of Genesis. Let's look to Genesis chapter 3. Let's look back to verse 14 and 15. Because here's something that I want to throw into the conversation. I don't know if you've ever had anybody do this before, and this is the wet cement part of the conversation today. So I'll throw this out, and you can tell me if I'm a lunatic or I'm a heretic or whatever. But what's interesting to me in terms of suffering and the question of suffering is that we have a lot to say from the biblical context about suffering. And we go all the way back to the beginning and woven into the original divine response to the fall, the problem of humanity choosing rebellion, and the subsequent injection of futility into the world in response. That's the judgment response that God does. We see another element of suffering, don't we? Look at verse 14. And this is in direct response to the adversary, who was in the garden, roaming around, not quite yet, but we could say like I think Paul does, roaming around looking for someone to devour, right? That's the New Testament reflection. But here's his response to the devil in terms of what just happened, devil. Guess what I've got reserved for you? Because you've done this, cursed are you more than all the cattle and more than all the beasts of the field, and on your belly you shall go, and dust you'll eat all the days of your life while you're roaming around on the earth, which you still are. And I'll put enmity between you and the woman. So there's conflict now between the seed. And between your seed and her seed, he, some unnamed individual, shall bruise you on the head, ouch, but you shall bruise him on the heel. Remember, we've talked about this before. So suffering from the beginning, here I see, woven into the divine response to the rebellion and the fall and everything that happens from Genesis 3 and then from this time forward. So in my mind, now what I'm trying to do is make connections with regards to the suffering of this, the suffering of the He. We start to see this painting start to shape up and start to fill out in vivid color. Places like, if we look at Isaiah, some of the prophets start to see glimpses of this. Let's turn to Isaiah 53. You probably all know where I'm going here. So this idea of suffering. This He, whoever this He is going to suffer. In response to, He's going to suffer at the hand of this fallenness and everything that happened in Genesis 3. Isaiah chapter 53, just a couple verses, verse 5 through 7. But He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon Him. Is that the word good? No, our peace. Okay. And by His scourging we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall upon Him. So that's the suffering that happens there. So we start to see with the ministry of this He, whoever this He is, it's going to involve suffering. He's going to suffer. So this is part of His role and His job description. And where all of this goes is an interesting place. We go all the way to the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 13. And I could take you to the cross. You all know the details there, so I won't, between the Isaiah text and what I'm going to show you in Revelation is the actual earthly event of the cross, where this He comes to fully demonstrate all of the details of what the prophet Isaiah describes in the fullness of the suffering that He undergoes at the cross. In what I'll show you here, I think I've got a good case to make the eternal suffering that Jesus underwent on our behalf. So is this what John's talking about in Revelation chapter 13, verse 8? And I translate the verse this way from the Greek. And all who dwell on the earth will worship Him, everyone whose name has not been written in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. And then I move the qualifying or descriptive prepositional phrase from the foundation of the world to the end. I think from the foundation of the world there modifies the activity of Him being slain. So I do that a little differently than the New American Standard. And in other translations, that's just part of the interpretive discussion of where that modifying phrase fits in that sentence. But if I'm right, and others who have made that observation, the idea of the Lamb being slain from before the foundation of the world kind of puts this into kind of what I call a cosmic eternal suffering realm. Is there an aspect of, I draw this picture. I've talked about this before, and with you all, the idea of there are eternal realities that find earthly expressions, like the tabernacle and its design. Certain things that are true in God's realm that find an earthly expression. So the tabernacle's built, but it exists and it's designed a certain way because it represents an eternal tabernacle, which will eventually down the road find the fullness of its earthly expression. But another thing that I'm throwing up here now, and this is in what concrete, but the idea of, my pen's running out, suffering. Is there an eternal aspect of suffering? Because we see it from the beginning, God starts to interject it into the role of the He in terms of this one will suffer, and eventually will find an earthly expression of suffering because it's an eternal reality. So that we see this and we see this, And well, eventually, this is all moving forward to the day of the Lord, when he will find his full expression as king. So it's one of those bookends, the bookends idea that I keep coming back to. So here's where we go from this. What if there is an eternal aspect of Christ's suffering, the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world, that not only finds its earthly expression in the cross, but here's what I'm going to add, but also in the testing and refinement of the faithful. How's that for an earthly expression? All right, now, so is there an aspect of I'm going to add the word eternal. I hope you all can see this. My pen's kind of running out. Eternal suffering of the Lamb that finds an earthly expression in the suffering of the saints. The testing. Well, suffering's part of testing, right? So I'm going to say testing / suffering. So it's this idea again. There's an intersection. I'm wondering if there's an intersection here. And here's why. I think I found this in the text. So I'm not going out rogue here. I'm not going, hog wild and just kind of grabbing for straws here. Let's just I'll show you a few verses here that I think, and I probably, talked about this and woven this into other places, but if we go to Romans, we'll go to a couple places in the New Testament. Romans chapter 8. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 8. All right, so Paul, some of the authors of the New Testament talk about suffering, and they talk about Christian suffering. Of course, Christian suffering was part of the whole first century experience of the early church, so shouldn't surprise us that these New Testament authors are ministering to their saints who are asking the why question. And Paul brings it into a very interesting context here in Romans chapter 8. So Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 14. So he's making the case here of who is it that's a son or a daughter of God. For all who are being, verse 14, chapter 8. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. For you've not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you've received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. This is a family affair. This is what Paul's talking. He's making the case that what I'm about ready to share with you is a family secret. It's part of who you are as the adopted family of God. Verse 16, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And, now he adds now we've got more information. Verse 17, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, right? I got a little dramatic there, sorry. In order that we may be glorified with him. That's the future part. Suffer with him so that we can be glorified with him. I don't know how to draw glory. Something wonderful. For I consider, Paul continues, so now he's speaking personally, I consider that the sufferings of this present time, that's in the futility of the fallenness of the world, and all of the things that come at us from all of the various categories that we've seen in the book of Job, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, we talked about that, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So, to answer your question about the why, now I'm introducing the idea of glory. I think that we have to talk about this idea of glory as it relates to the testing of the saints who experience suffering, but are, according to Paul, and we'll get to the Peter passage here in a second, are suffering with Christ, because that out of that comes this thing called glory. There's glory that's being produced. Here's where it really gets crazy. I don't know if this glory could be produced, would it not be for a fallen world? How's that? So if the world wasn't fallen in this particular kind of way, subjected to futility, and what we see going on in the book of Job, where the righteous, those who are righteous, are suffering, but what's the why question is because even for Job, it's producing this glory. And if the world hadn't fallen, if there was no reason for the eternal suffering of the Lamb of God, then we'd be in a different scenario completely. So there's some value, moral value, to our suffering because it's producing glory in this particular kind of way. This is true this is the family secret, according to Paul. This is within the family of God. So this is involving suffering of the saints. This is not animal suffering. It doesn't have anything to do with any of that other kind of, this is a unique kind of suffering that we're trying to talk about here. And it's unique to the book of Job, and it fits and it's consistent with these other places. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 through 11. It's one of those New Testament books. 1 Peter chapter 5. Here's where it really gets interesting. I'm wondering if when Peter's having his quiet time, he has a little bit of an allusion here to the book of Job. I'm wondering if that's what he's seeing here. 1 Peter chapter 5, beginning in verse 6. Here's Peter, and of course Peter is writing to the persecuted church in the first century. He's writing to, he starts his, I think it's 1 Peter, his letter this way is addressing those who are suffering. But he's got it here in his last chapter. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. There's that parallel to Paul there, casting all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, here's the devil again, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. Here's the parallel to Paul. After you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Some of those terms, confirm, strengthen, establish, line up pretty strongly with the whole byproduct of testing. You know, the idea of our faith is tested, it's strengthened. Part of some of the things that come out of, and we see this in the book of Job, out of testing, a deeper knowledge of who the Lord is, who God is. That's one of the benefits. Our faith is made more pure. But on an eternal level, I'm thinking, I'm building this case that with Paul and with Peter now, and I think he might be alluding to even the book of Job by bringing up the adversary, the devil, prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to take out like he did in the book of Job. But what we've got here is this glory idea coming through. So now how much do we get into this discussion with the person who is on their hospital bed and they're asking this why question? You know, I don't know. It might be a little too much. I mean, it's not. I probably would end up like one of Job's friends at that point, you know, using too many words, just not being silent, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But, you know, it might be appropriate at times, and especially with the suffering saint, you know, that old gray-haired grandmother who's been the saint of your church, and all of a sudden she's come down with cancer. She knows the answer to this question, probably already. You're just reminding her at that point. You know, read her the text out of Romans 8 and encourage her with the idea, there's glory. You're producing glory in a way that's unique because you're a suffering saint, and it's at the hands of a world that's fallen, but it's unique because it wouldn't happen otherwise. And it gets a little bit into the why question. So even God, how can God, produce glory out of a fallen world? How can glory come out of a world that's fallen and broken? And that kind of a thing. So it seems to be the case that this is part of the divine response. We won't see the fullness of this. This is part of the waiting thing that we have to do. This is where our faith comes in. This is where I think we see the person of Job. He gets to the end. We'll get to the end of the book of Job, and we'll see that he's silent. He doesn't have anything to say. But I think there's I'll show you in the book of Job. We'll get to it, where I think even Job recognizes there's a future aspect, a future resolution with regards to his experience of suffering as it relates to his relationship with the Lord. So, all right. And now we add to our list the devil is part of the reality at times, it seems, that can cause some of our suffering at the hands or under the sovereignty of God in the case of Job. I'm not saying that the devil's around every corner, but sometimes we know maybe we're a little bit too limp or light on the fact that the devil is real and he has an agenda, and it's to meddle up all of this. Wonderful. To mess this up so that this doesn't happen. He hates that. Certainly doesn't want that to happen. But the irony to this whole thing is that even in the midst of Job's situation, which was the full force of all of the causes of suffering, in the midst of all that, he's producing this. So even, this gets really crazy, even God can get glory out of the devil and his agenda. He's messing things up, or he thinks, trying to mess up Job, get him to curse God. None of that happens. Even his wife comes in, who she's grieving too, curse God and die. Job says, no, we're going to get to that in just a minute here, but it's not going to happen. So how can the Lord get glory out of the devil, who's part of this fallen world as well? Well, he does, I think, in the book of Job. Through the testing of the faithful and the refining and the testing of the suffering saints, that's how God gets glory and snuffs out the satanic agenda. And that gets us back to our participation with the suffering of the he in this idea. So I'm still kind of working this out, but it's something I think has some potential. So I'll leave that with you, and you can email me later and say, that was the craziest thing I've ever heard. But you see let's go back to the book of Job. And how does Job respond? This gets us into another question that I think is part of this. Then his wife comes in, and of course we see the aftermath of whatever this ailment is. Verse 7 gives us some details. Sore, boils. He's obviously in a lot of pain. Job is with regards to this particular ailment. It's not taking his life, but it's making his life awfully miserable. And then his wife comes into this situation. Of course, sometimes we get a little too, negative and critical of his wife, but we have to recognize she's grieving too. She's grieving loss, and they're grieving together as a couple. And she's not quite where Job is in his situation, but verse 9. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Well, that's what the adversary wants him to do. But he says to her, and this gets into another question. It's the theological question in Job's response. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Here's his question to her. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. All right. So verse 10 asks another interesting question. This idea of adversity, we've seen this kind of dichotomy before. So are we to accept only good and not, and the Hebrew word is ra, or bad. Sometimes this word, you see it translated evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's really the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. So it really gets into the same language that we see from the very beginning in Genesis 3 and the original rebellion of Adam and Eve. But the good and bad, Job's question is related to this Hebrew word. Should we only accept good and not Hebrew ra, or bad? It's not the word for evil. Adversity might be a good translation. Bad's a little generic and plain Jane. So the idea of adversity fits into the context, and that's why the translators go that way. But it's really just the plain word, Hebrew word that means bad. Now, interestingly, this question, shall we only accept the good and not the bad? Remember, that falls into the face of the original question or challenge from the devil. He's only, Job's only worshiping and praising you because you've given him good all of his life. Now the question of good and bad comes into Job's situation. Now the bad, I think, has to be connected in some way to our list, our growing list of things that we've got over here working to create the heat, you might say, or the refining process for Job in terms of him being tested. Now let's go back to Ecclesiastes and remind ourselves, if we remember that in the book of Ecclesiastes, the author is asking a very similar question. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. The author here, Ecclesiastes, consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent? See, there's an interesting question, right? In the day of prosperity, or good, that's the word for good, prosperity. In the day of good, be happy. But in the day of bad, there's the word adversity, consider. Pause. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not discover anything that will be after him. This fits with the book of Job. This is where we're wrestling. Job is asking his wife this question: am I only allowed to accept good and not bad? It's the same question that we see in the book of Ecclesiastes. Y'all see that connection? Is that fair? There's another connection that I want to make, and we go back to the book of Genesis chapter 50. And interestingly, like Job at the end of his testing cycle, Joseph emerges with the correct theology for the day. After all that's happened, and at the very end, we see the thesis statement of the Joseph narrative in chapter 50, verse 20. And as for you, aka you brothers, you meant bad against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Here we have again the contrast between good and bad. So what about Job's question? Is that a question? How would you evaluate that question in its how do we do this? If you've got somebody, let's just paint this picture. You've got somebody from your church you're visiting them at home, and they've got, well, like Job, a prolonged, debilitating illness of some kind, and they're going through a lot of pain. Evaluate this question. How is it going to work in your ministry of encouragement and helping that person deal with their situation? Are we only allowed to accept good and not bad? All right, talk to your talking buddy and see how this pans out. Okay, let's pull back together here. How fair or right is this a question for Job? Let's evaluate his question. What did you come up with? Anybody? Let's see. I'm going to have to call on some people. How about Lauren over here in the back? Did y'all talk about stuff? What y'all talk about? You didn't? Oh, no. How about, let's see. Ryan. Where are you? What did y'all talk about? That's you.
We kind of talked about it's probably not the question you want to lead with if you're outside the situation.
I agree.
It's more of a reactive questions.
Yeah.
Past the time that someone's, I don't know what a reasonable time frame is, but if someone's going through a grieving process, you need to allow some time.
Or a suffering process.
Yeah, suffering process. You need to allow some time for them to really process their emotional component of that before you can start bringing a non-emotional piece into the puzzle. But once they're in a place where they're questioning, or it's appropriate for you to give them an answer.
Maybe it's a more appropriate question from us. Maybe this is what you're saying after the event happens. So kind of like looking back and evaluating it. Sometimes people have to do that too. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's more reactive, evaluative question.
Yeah, I think it's a helpful question. Of course, it's in the Bible. It's the one that Job's asking his wife in this case, who may need to be helped along a little bit in her own grieving process. But in my chalkboard talk up here, I added a kind of a little addition to this. This might be helpful. I don't know if this fits with any of some of the things that you may have said, but if I'm the one on the hospital bed, and let's say I come through and I've got some kind of a recovery period, I come out of it and now I'm, looking around and looking back on the experience of suffering, and then I'm asking the why question. It might be a question that might be worth asking. Well, I'm mad at God. People get that way, right? After something happens. We were talking about divorce in our Sunday school class yesterday, and my teacher's the one that lost his wife earlier this year. His daughter went through a ugly divorce in the same year. I mean, he's almost like Job himself. I'll have to share that with them. But we were talking about the aftermath of one who's gone through that horrific experience of divorce. And here his daughter was sitting in the front row. Here he is teaching on divorce, and she's giving amen to everything and sharing, and it's hard on the kids, and the emotions are just overwhelming, and she was being very, very vulnerable with kind of like it happened. I went through that, and I went through extreme suffering. I'm still suffering, but I'm looking back on it. So this good and bad idea, is it fair to only accept the good without the bad? And it may not always work, but for me, I've thought about this a little bit. It takes a little bit of the sting away, getting back to this idea. So if I'm the one being tested through whatever version of heat that's coming from the fallenness of the world, and I move through this experience as one who fears God, getting back to the fear of God, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and all this wisdom material all comes back to the fear of God. That helps me to navigate through the experience in such a way. So good and bad, it helps me to keep that balance, that recognizing that maybe in some mysterious kind of way, and I don't, like Job, not going to have all my questions answered, to the severity, or I've used the term before, the amplification that comes, the severity of the disease, the duration of the disease, or all of that. But I do get to the end, and this helps me to understand if it's going somewhere and it has some eternal value. So maybe it also connects with this idea that I'm suffering with someone. I'm not alone in my suffering, but because I'm suffering with someone, and it leads to this, that helps the sting of this aspect of it. I'm not so prone to blame God and be angry at God for the rest of my life. Does that make sense? A little bit like that. That gets complicated, and you counselors are much more better at it than me, but I don't know. It's just an idea that how it all fits together. You know people who are perpetually mad at God and angry at God. Something tragic has happened in their life, and it's hard for them to let go of it. But it's just one approach that I'd have to kind of think about and work out. Marla?
Do you think, like, when a person is broken, like somebody who is broken, God can reveal more of who He is?
Oh, through brokenness?
Yes, sir.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good observation. Mm-hmm. That's part of the knowing the depths of knowing God. For the saint who's suffering is largely the byproduct, the deeper understanding of who God is, how God works, and their experience of God sometimes deepens when the reality and the realness of life really hits. Every distraction is stripped away. That's what happens when you're being tested, like Israel in the wilderness. All the distractions, you're just focusing on what really matters. Your relationship with the Lord and the loved ones around you and the things that are really real. Did you have something?
Well, like, I kind of feel like right now I'm in this season where I'm kind of getting the best of both.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, I'm engaged, and, like, no one ever told me what engagement was going to be like, and I always thought it was going to be this, like, really great, wonderful season. And it has been. And, like, my fiance and I celebrated our 5-month anniversary yesterday, and we had a really great afternoon. We went to the botanical gardens. Like, it's a memory that I'm going to have forever.
Yeah.
And then at, like, 8:30 last night, we just started this, like, awful fight.
Oh, no.
Kind of just, I mean, a lot of it was, like, flowing out of, like, my insecurities and his insecurities, like, fears, and kind of just wrestling with places where we don't fully trust the Lord. And so, like, I'm kind of getting, like, this really good and bad at this moment.
Yeah.
And what I'm finding is that, like, the good things and the bad things kind of reveal different parts of who God is.
That's interesting.
And
Yeah.
that, like, sometimes when I'm going through, like, really difficult things, like, it kind of helps me to wrestle with His sovereignty, and kind of helps me wrestle with some of His justice, and wrestle with some of His, like, mercy. Whereas sometimes in the good, like, I just see one, like, I kind of see one or the other in both circumstances. Yeah. And we need both.
That's a good point.
Lord.
Yeah, how do we say it? The fullness of the experience of suffering happens with the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And that's good. So as you're navigating through, you've had good, but here's bad, and it's the fullness of the experience that amplifies who God is, and that's good. Yeah. Let's keep going here. So we get back to, and here's where I come back to, and again, I don't think I'd ever win an argument against him, but Richard Dawkins, who's going to come at me with this, and this idea, I don't think he's ever going to grab onto this, but at least I, as a Christian, as a one who's of the Godism worldview, according to Kukul, I do have a response in terms of there's not meaninglessness and there's not a lack of value to the experience of my suffering at the hands of the matter, the stuff that's out there in the world, those things that happen, various degrees and various amplitudes, and but I have a response to the Richard Dawkins of the world, and it's a coherent response. It's a response that comes out of my text, not the scientific manual that he studies, but it addresses the real question in a real honest way, and it doesn't force me into this world to think that there is no God. No, it draws me closer to the realization that, no, I live in a world that's definitely sovereign and controlled by God. And it's a world that I'm moving through and I'm navigating through. I acknowledge that I'm being tested all the time, but there's a product of this testing. And for whatever source and reason that comes, I know that testing is the navigational tool, and my gyroscope is the fear of God that I have that allows me to navigate through the good and bad and recognize that there's something to be said of value of my suffering with someone. So I come back to this, that there's one who suffered before me and suffered on my behalf. And according to the authors in the New Testament, I'm being invited to suffer with him. And all of that is a response to the original problem in the introduction of the devil and his agenda. So he wants to crash and burn this whole thing, but the irony is that even out of his activity, glory can be the product. And in the magnitude and the brilliance of God as the ultimate creator and designer of all things, that's just interesting to me. So, all right. Well, we find that response and other worldviews are really come out kind of weak on that, I think, in terms of coming up with a solution to that problem. So if you're in a worldview discussion, that might be the way to go to get somebody's attention. Now we get to some other aspects of counseling that I think really surprisingly come out of the book of Job that I think are really helpful for our future counseling ministry. So let's go back to the book of Job. And we'll look at chapter 2. All right. Now all of that happens, and we get to the end of the 2 cycles of Job's suffering, aka testing, and all of this. And we see that Job and his wife are grieving the loss, and now dealing with, together as a couple, his physical ailment. After the question we see in chapter 2, verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard all of this bad or adversity that had come upon him, they each came one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance, they did not recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky, and they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word. For they saw that his pain was very great. And I'll make the case that was the most helpful thing that they could have done, and they did it. And they just, they grieved with him, they cried with him, they remained with him, and they said nothing for 7 days. That's a good counseling strategy for all of you. Sometimes it's just best to be quiet. Yeah, you like that? I think it's there, and it's what they did first, to their credit, so we can't beat up on those friends too bad. You think that they're all a bunch of Huey, Louie, and Deweys showing up, not knowing what to say. No, they started out very, very right and very strong, and that's what we do when we are helping someone who's going through this. We we grieve with them. We can put on our sackcloth and put ashes on our head. Well, there's modern ways of grieving, grieving with, crying with, and remaining with. Our presence is so important. You got to know that when you're dealing with someone who's grieving, they need people around them. That's very helpful. People who say nothing, people who help wash dishes but don't necessarily try to solve and fix things. It's about time you get, the guy who, my Sunday school teacher who lost his wife earlier, he had somebody come in and ask him out for breakfast, and his basic advice was, well, you got to just get over this and go find another woman. He actually had somebody say that, yeah, you can do it. You're a good-looking guy. I was like, thanks, buddy. Can I just grieve a little bit? My brother-in-law, who hung out with over spring break, he's a doctor who's he runs a dialysis, works in a dialysis unit. And if you know anything about dialysis, you're dealing with a lot of people who are near the end of their life. When the kidneys start failing and, you've got all those dominoes that start falling over. We talked about that, and he's an interesting guy. I think given a little more time, he might be right in there with us, but he's just a little more of a Thomas Jeffersonian type and kind of a little more of a deist. He doesn't want God to be so involved because he sees every day as a doctor, to his honesty, he shares this with me. I see this, the bad, I see that this thing, tearing apart, as a doctor, he has to deal with this side of life every day, and he's having to counsel the dialysis patients. So interesting, he gave this talk to a bunch of young doctors. He's a well-established doctor with a lot of experience, and his presentation started off like this. The topic was counseling dialysis patients, end of life dialysis patients. What do you say? And here's what he said. He showed me his PowerPoints, and he starts it off and he says, and he gets up and here's the most important thing for you to do when you counsel the dialysis patients. And he went on for a whole minute. He said nothing. And that was like, everybody was like, oh, what do I do? Look down, look around, check my phone, This is like nervous, you get a little nervous with the quietness and the silence. But he wanted to make his point because it is awkward when you're at that point and you just don't have anything to say. The best thing is to say nothing. But you get over your awkwardness and you let them talk. Don't talk for them. Don't put words in their mouth and So he kind of makes that a part of his training for young doctors who are, it's the hardest thing to do is to be silent. After you present the reality of the situation, he's the hardest thing for him to do as a doctor. So this is what it is. Probably have a month. He's having to tell families that all the time. You've got 2 months at best. And then he has to be silent and let them respond. He's honest to tell me that's one of the things is the hardest things about my job. That's what I do every single day. I have a lot of respect for him, And it's just like, yeah, you're in the book of Job. Let me show you. I showed him this chapter. I said, these guys were silent for 7 days. He said he loved it. He said, I didn't know that was there. I'm going to use that in my next presentation. So he said, we should write an article together or something. What?
I said, oh boy.
What, the book of Job?
Oh, if he just uses it without knowing
Oh, yeah. Well, the idea of being silent, yeah. So that's the human, when we experience loss, grieving is really a pretty common emotion around the world globally. Now, here's what I want to do, and I've been kind of long-winded today about the book of Job. I hope I'm not. Anyway, we may talk about the book of Job a little bit next week too. But we're not behind. We'll get caught up. I think the book of Job is so powerful from this perspective. Now here's where I go a little different direction, and I do this purposely. It just fits, but it's going to take us to another book. And the reason I do this is because I started asking myself the question: the book of Job's usefulness in the history of Israel. It's a wisdom book, like all the other wisdom books, and the collection of Proverbs. These were being used by the believing community. These were books that were produced and were helpful for those who were asking these questions. So I asked myself the question, and I ask us, you answer this question for me. Think about the history of Israel, and when was it in their history where a lot of people would have been hanging out at the Starbucks grieving loss? Yeah? People who are in exile, right. What did they lose? Everything. Some of the most precious things to them, especially the faithful, the group of we're not talking about the idolaters that were around when everybody went together on the same bus, right, to exile. The faithful remnant were within the broader community of rebels, but everybody went on the same train to Babylon out of Jerusalem. They lost their temple. They lost their city, their homes. They lost everything. Some of them may have lost the life of loved ones. We don't have all the battle statistics in terms of the siege, 3 years of siege, and the horrors of siege that were going on. I'm sure that they were experiencing some pretty horrific things. All of that's fair game for grieving loss. Now they're in exile. Ezekiel the prophet is there. He's their pastor, and we'll get into his book when we get to the prophets. But another interesting prophet who was also at work in and around that time was the prophet Jeremiah. His backstory is he's still in Jerusalem with the poorest of the poor, the leftovers of the exilic, the 3 deportations that came, and the wheels of the Babylonians came and took different groups of people out, and they chose to leave some behind, and Jeremiah chose to stay with the group that was left behind and be their pastor, you might say, their encourager. But Jeremiah has a ministry to the exiles, and he has a writing ministry to the exiles, I think. I think that's fair to say. And you all know what book that is. Lamentations. Yeah. Lamentations is the sister book to the whole corpus of Jeremiah's prophetic preaching ministry. But it's just 5 chapters, right? And it's typically a companion book to the book of Jeremiah. But it's a book like Job. It's a short book, and it's a compact book, and it's basically the book that is addressed, I think, to the grieving exiles, and it was written for them. And it's poetry, like what we've seen with Psalms. It's a lot like in the genre. Let's look to Psalm 137. Psalm 137. We read this one before when we covered the Psalms, but just as a way of reminder, talk about the power of a good, well-written song. Maybe I should have shared this with my group last night about how music and how worship helps us through grieving, but you see the tone of those who were in exile, chapter Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept. When we remembered Zion, upon the willows in the midst of it, we hung our harps. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirthed in saying, "Sing one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forgot you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, and if I don't exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom. We want gloom, doom, and despair against those enemies. We don't want any good thing to happen to them. So this gets into the raw. We talked about the type of psalms that do that, the imprecatory psalms. So anyway, this is a raw nerve for the exiles. Now the prophet Jeremiah, and his role comes in terms of ministering to the exiles as one who's back in Jerusalem. And he writes down 5 chapters for a grieving nation. And he probably fits well into this genre of the soggy bottom boys. I hope my technology works. All right, enough of that. Okay. Well, that sets us up for Lamentations. Let's turn there to Lamentations chapter 3. I want to focus on Lamentations before we finish up Job, just because I want us to see this powerful connection between how a book like Job would have ministered to the group that's in Babylon, those who are grieving the loss, the national grief. And I see a parallel to, and I just thought to myself, well, Lamentations, I read it again and not too long ago in the thought process of thinking about how we're going to talk about the book of Job, and I found some interesting connections in Lamentations to what we've already talked about in Job. Not surprisingly, some of the same theological themes emerge from Jeremiah, who is operating like the author of Job and trying to help this grieving group move through their grief. So let's take a look at chapter 3, verse 1. This is a chapter that has kind of a high center of gravity, high concentration of theology. This particular chapter, really all 5 chapters are helpful, but I just want to focus in chapter 3. And here's the Soggy Bottom Boys song. I am the man who has seen affliction. Because of the rod of his wrath, he has driven me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely against me he's turned his hand repeatedly all the day. He's caused my flesh and my skin to waste away. There's parallels there to Job. He's broken my bones. He's besieged and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship. In dark places he's made me dwell like those who have long been dead. He's walled me in so that I cannot go out. He's made my chain heavy. This really has some powerful ministry application. Even when I cry out and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. People feel this way, don't they? He's blocked my ways with hewn stone, and he's made my paths crooked. He is to me like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in secret places. He's turned aside my ways and torn me to pieces. He made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for the arrow. He made the arrows of his quiver to enter into my inward parts. I've become a laughingstock to all my people. They're mocking song all the day. He's filled me with bitterness. He made me drunk with warm wood. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He made me cower in the dust, and my soul has been rejected from peace or shalom. I have forgotten happiness, so that I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. I got a little dramatic there. But now notice what happens. Verse 19. And this is where the powerful, inspired prophet gets into some of his most powerful ministry. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. There's the transition. A soul that remembers and a soul that bows down. How do you think about a soul that remembers? How's a soul remember? What's a remembering soul? And a soul that bows down, you know? What's the picture here that the prophet is painting? I got this picture. It's kind of interesting, you know? Captures the bowing soul, the soul that remembers. So it's interesting. In the midst of, being in the storm, there's certain posture that we have, just like what we saw with Job. In the midst of his grief and his grieving cycle, he bows, he grieves, but he also worships. There's a soul that bows. We've talked about before here's where I think it connects to our discussion up here. The soul that bows, a soul that is a soul that remembers. So in the picture, in like Job, we see that in the storm, there's worship going on, because that comes from the heart that fears the Lord. It's the one who fears the Lord. It comes back to the one who fears the Lord, because this posture has everything to do with the heart. And this soul idea, I think the idea of remembering, the remembering soul, what does the soul, remembering soul, remember? And we see that here in the text. Verse 21, this I recall to my mind. Therefore, because I do, I have hope. Here's what I do. I recall that. Verse 22, the Lord's loving kindness and deeds never cease, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. There's what the soul says when it remembers. The Lord is my portion. Therefore, I have hope in him. The Lord is, here's our word, good to those who wait for him. Here's what the soul who remembers. He's good to the person who seeks him. And it is good that he waits silently, for the salvation is from the Lord. All right? So someone a soul that remembers is a soul that's really attached to the one who fears the Lord. He's got that inner orientation, so he's able to navigate through good and bad and end up on the worship side of things. But here, it's because he fears the Lord. Now we have more details from the prophet Jeremiah. One who fears the Lord has the soul that never forgets. What is it that the Lord's done? How can he say the Lord's loving kindnesses never fail? He looks at his past and he says, look at the Lord's, I have a lifetime of the faithfulness of the Lord. Lifetime of the faithfulness of the Lord. I'm looking back. Now that gives me the courage to navigate and look ahead. I'm in between the two extremes of God's glory, you might say, I'm suffering with the one who suffered on my behalf, because I know that that's producing an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison. So I have no reason to complain like Paul or to bellyache about my present suffering, because it's not worthy to be compared to the glory that's to be revealed. That's what a soul that remembers does. It's that kind of thinking, heart thinking that you do with a soul that remembers. And here's the worship aspect, verse 20, and a soul that's bowed down within me. So that might be helpful for us too, in terms of encouraging people. And that's what a soul that remembers does and declares in the midst of the storm, all of those things that we read. And we jump down to verse 31. More things that the soul that remembers, verse 31 in chapter 3. For the Lord will not reject forever. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion. You see that? That's a powerful verse. According to his abundant loving kindness. Remember, that loving kindness idea is the Hebrew chesed. You got to spit it when you say it. It's that covenant loyalty, covenant grace. It goes a lot of different directions, but it's the fact that God's not ever going to retract his end of the deal, the unconditional promises that he's made. And here we can sing theological songs about the unwavering commitment and the unconditional promises to Abraham, the Davidic covenant, and all of those things that the prophets come back to encourage the people with regards to, we have a future. Why? It's because we have an unconditional promising God. He's promised these things in there. He can't go against who he is. So verse 33, for he does not afflict willingly or grieve the sons of men to crush under his feet all the prisoners of the land, to deprive a man of justice in the presence of the Most High to defraud a man in his lawsuit. Of these things the Lord does not approve. Who is there who speaks, and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? And here's our question, and it comes up again. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and Hebrew Ra, bad, go forth? Let's ask again in the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah is in alignment with in Solomon and Ecclesiastes. He's in alignment with Job and his question to his wife, and it's the same question. We've got to be, and it's the heart that fears is the heart that navigates through the good and bad and continues to have this posture of worship. It's the soul that remembers. We have more details there so that's the question, verse 38. That's the punchline that I just wanted to give us today. So then we start with, after all of this, now we go back to Job. So here's, just as a purpose for remembering this peg in our discussion, just remember that for our final exam in maybe a short essay, it might come up again. Just how these things all connect on this question. It's a powerful question. Can we only accept good and not bad? Well, hey, it comes up in 3 different places, and it's all attempted, the authors are all attempting to encourage those who are going through grieving. And that's a powerful question. So, so we can talk about that, and we'll, talk about Job and all of these things. So the connection between Lamentations and Job, I think, is a pretty powerful connection on this point. So, all right. Almost tempted to say, let's wrap this up and save it for next week. But it's chapter 3, and I'm not obviously going to cover all the details of the round, all the various rounds of discourse that go back and forth between Job and his friends. Chapter 3, oops, I'm not there yet. Now we're back in Job. Chapter 3 is when the conversation begins after all of this. And now that we know all of this, see, that's the point. This is where Job's at as he begins his grieving process. And now we start to hear from the friends. Here's what Job says in chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. You see, he's got a raw nerve here in terms of his ongoing grieving process. He's being honest with these friends now. They're letting him talk. That's another good thing. They're silent, and finally he speaks. They had started talking right away on day 1. I don't think Job would have ever gotten a chance to complain a little bit here. But it's another counseling principle that sometimes you just have to be silent, and that forces the other person to lets them, when they're ready, speak and talk and be honest and communicate their real raw nerve feelings that they have. Verses 11 and 13, ongoing about his birth. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from my womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, and why the breasts that I should suck? He cursed the day that I was born. And what comes next is the advice from Job's friends. And we've talked about the basic, very similar approach, really, that all the friends apply to Job's situation. It's that, now we'll talk about capital G God, because that's who they're referring to. So Job, the God who you worship, he is just, and he rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. So we see now how shallow their advice is, their basic approach. They also, along their lines, they would say suffering is the evidence of wrongdoing, because you're being punished. Ergo, here's the remedy, Job. You ready? Confess your sin and repent. So that's kind of the line, kind of the common thread that we see. God rewards the righteous. Suffering is the evidence of wrongdoing or sin. So, Job, Say it one more time. You're going to need to confess your sin and repent. So we see a little bit of that come through in Eliphaz. Let's take a look at chapter 4, verse 17 through 21. Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? He puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. How much more those who dwell in the houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth. Between morning and evening they are broken in pieces. Observed, they perish forever. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die yet without wisdom. So Eliphaz, did I read the right one? Chapter 17. So Eliphaz, on the aftermath of having some kind of mystical experience of his own, his thesis does not really address Job's complaint. He claims that no human being, there's no human out there that can be righteous before God. So in Job's response, we see in chapter 6, we'll just cover bits and pieces of this, verse 24. In Job's response, here's what he says to that. Teach me, and I will be silent, and show me how I have erred. How painful are honest words, but what does your argument prove? Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of one in despair belong to the wind? You even cast lots for the orphans. You barter over your friend. And now please look at me and see if I lie to your face. Desist now, and let there be no injustice. Even desist. My righteousness is yet in it. Is there injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern my own calamities? Basically what Job's saying is, show me where I've erred. Thanks, friend. If there's something that I have to confess here, some sin in my life, please show me. I don't know what it is. I've been thinking about this, racking my brain and my heart, but haven't come up with anything. It's not that we're saying Job is sinlessly perfect, but his situation certainly cannot fit into this ancient mindset of God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. What you're telling me is that I'm wicked, but I'm not sinlessly perfect, but I'm not wicked. So Job is. We'll move on to the next friend, covering. Sorry for the violent picture. So now we have friend number 2, Bildad. He's going to put a slightly different spin on things for Job. In chapter 8, verses 2 through 10. We'll start reading there. So Bildad, or Bildad, how long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the El Shaddai pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression. If you would seek God and implore the compassion of the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely how he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteousness, your righteous estate. So there's a little bit different spin. Look, if the source of the sin, Job, is not in you, then it's in your kids. See, your children are to blame, and that's the cause to all of this. That's why God has snuck in here and punished you in this way. It's because of the sin of your children. Job responds with some raw nerve and honesty in chapter 10. So Job responds to this. Obviously, we're covering this kind of quickly now. First, chapter 10, verses 1 through 7. I loathe my own life. I will give full vent to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why thou dost contend with me. Is it right for thee indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of thy hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked? How hast thou eyes of flesh, or dost thou see a man as a man sees? Are thy days as the days of a mortal, or the years as man's years, that thou shouldst seek my guilt and search after my sin according to thy knowledge? I am indeed not guilty, yet there is no deliverance from my hand. Job responds, very honestly there. The problem is in pinning any kind of concentrated wickedness in Job's life, and even the life of his household. So we have another friend come on the scene, Zophar, in chapter 11, and verses 1 through 9. He's going to offer a very sharp rebuke against Job. And Zophar, the Naamathite, answers, verse 2 in chapter 11. Shall a multitude of words go unanswered, and a talkative man be acquitted? Shall your boast silence men? And shall you scoff and none rebuke? For you have said, my teaching is pure, and I am innocent in your eyes. But would that God might speak and open his lips against you, and show you the secrets of wisdom. For sound wisdom has two sides. Know then that God forgets a part of your iniquity. Can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? They are high as the heavens. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes by or shuts up or calls an assembly, who can restrain him? So the idea, Zophar basically expanding the argument a little bit with Job. God's wisdom is unlimited. Job, you've got no right to challenge this. So again, Zophar comes back because, Job, you've got no perspective in this. You've got to accept that your suffering is at the hand and displeasure of God. So that's what Zophar is trying to get Job to consider. Zophar is going to reiterate that Job just needs to find something to confess and repent over. Chapter 11, verse 13, we see a little bit of that. If you direct your heart right and spread out your hands to him, if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away and do not let wickedness dwell in your tents. Then, and only then, indeed, you could lift up your face without moral defect. And you would be steadfast and not fear. You see the kind of idea. We're getting back to the idea. You just not looked hard enough, Job. Job's going to reach his limit. And he's going to call this group of friends all a bunch of liars. And he's going to charge them with misrepresenting God. In chapter 13, verse 1 through 7, Job says to his friends, behold, my eye has seen all of this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty and desire to argue with God, but you smear with lies. You are all worthless physicians. I love that. Just stop looking at my heart. It's fine. Oh, that you would be completely silent, and that it would become your wisdom. Please hear my argument and listen to the contentions of my lips. Will you speak what is unjust for God and speak what is deceitful for him? Will you show partiality for him, or will you contend for God? Will it be well when he examines you? Or will you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely reprove you if you secretly show partiality. You see his sharpness in his response coming back. Job's finally going to claim that in chapter 13, you see in verse 13, he's going to claim that his vindication will come. 13 down through verse 18. Job says, "Be silent before me, so that I may speak. Then let it come on me what may. Why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hands? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. This also will be my salvation. For a godless man may not come before his presence. Listen carefully to my speech, and let my declaration fill your ears. Behold, now I have prepared my case. I know that I will be vindicated. Who will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die." Let's see. Yeah, I just wanted to stop right there. So then Job continues in the next chapter. He responds in an interesting way. So he's He's waiting. You know, he knows that his vindication will come. You see glimpses of Job's realization that the Lord he's just, and he knows my situation. He knows what's in my heart, coming from Job. And in chapter 14, we see verse 7 through, here we go, starting in verse 7, chapter 14. For there is hope for a tree when it is cut down that it will sprout again. Some scholars have maybe suggested there's a little bit in that theology there with regards to resurrection, but it might be overdone. I don't know. And its shoots will not fail, though its roots grow old in the ground and its stump dies in the dry soil. At the scent of water, it will flourish and put forth sprigs like a plant. But man dies and lies prostrate. Man expires, and where is he? So this dialogue continues between Job and his friends, and I just wanted to get to this theological high point before we end today. Let's turn to chapter 19. And we see Job continuing to respond to his friends. Chapter 19, verse 23. This might be a theological high point within the whole scope of the conversation that takes place between Job and his friends. Job gets it right here in chapter 19. Beginning in verse 23. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that with an iron stylus and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. What do I know, Job? What does Job know? What do I know? As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that the last he will take his stand on the earth. So that's down through verse 29. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. It's another resurrection thing right there. Whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes shall see, and not another. My heart faints within me. If you say, how shall we persecute him? And what pretext for a case against him may we find? Then be afraid of the sword for yourselves, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, so that you may know there is judgment. So, what does Job know? So you see the same kind of language there. There's the Redeemer idea. That's the same idea, the kinsman Redeemer terminology that comes out of the book of Ruth. One who comes into a situation and represents the faithful in the appropriate way. So that kinsman Redeemer idea. So that's what Job knows. And that's something that we can, and I'll just end here with terms of those of us in terms of helping those who are going through grieving. We can come to this high point in the book of Job in terms of reminding people of what's true about God, who God is, his unchangingness, and those are the tent pegs that people need in times of going and navigating through grief, so they don't get blown over by the storm. We were in a storm where our tent literally was being pushed over by the wind all the way over on its side, like we were at the top of Mount Everest or something. One of those collapsible, flexible type tents with those things, those tent pegs, or those poles that you have to kind of assemble, and they bend. They've got that bendability. But our tent stood. I mean, we were dry the next morning. We had staked it down, Otherwise, we would have been blown away, That's what people need when they're going through grieving, is to be reminded. And this is a helpful ministry, is to remind them of those specific aspects and qualities of who God is and his unchanging nature. So you see evidence of that here in the book of Job. Job's picking up on some of these things that he knows about who God is, So, well, on that, we'll end, and we got just a few more things to say about Job. And then we'll come back next week and get back into some of the history books, Ezra and Nehemiah. All right? So thanks for your patience today.
Good. All right, let's try to bounce that.